College football nerds here talking Iron Bowl. Y'all knew we were going to get into this one. Got some disappointed but interested Alabama fans joining us and some Auburn fans coming off a high with their marathon game against Texas A&M. I got Josh with me. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. We're going to talk about these two teams and what Vegas sees. We're going to go ahead and get that out of the way, Josh. But before we do, I want to remind y'all, please like, please subscribe. Y'all are not new to this game. Y'all been around the block with us for a while. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'm kind of disappointed in you, but there's still room to win my favor and Josh's favor back. All right, Josh, Vegas has got this as a 13.5 point spread, which is a little wild because it opened, I think, around 12.5. It's moved up in Alabama's favor. And if you watch these two teams play last weekend, you'd be like, what is going on? I've got some theories. I'm going to share you my theories, and I want you to react to them and maybe share some of your theories. I think, first of all, Road Milroe, Road Alabama, except for that LSU game, have been a little suspect this year. Maybe you can say Wisconsin game too, but against good defenses, they've struggled. Alabama has not put back-to-back poor games together this year. They haven't been bad twice in a row. I think that is notable as well, and I think that we might be over invested in how bad Alabama looked and how good Auburn looked. Might be a little bit of fool's gold, but let's get into it.
It's interesting to try to break down in a lot of levels why the line is what it is. Daniel, can I do something totally crazy? And can I go straight in the computer model and show where our model is before we get into theories too? So why I want to do that and is if you actually look at our model, it has this game, Alabama 29.7, Auburn 19.8, basically 30-20. That is almost exactly what Vegas is saying, right? So this is a 50-point over-under, Alabama by 10, but this is a home game for Alabama, and if you want to figure out how you get to 13 from 10, it's the fact they're at home. People talk about 2 to 4 points. Daniel, I don't think it's nearly that cut and dry that there's a particular number. And in this case, I do think it's actually a bigger number that favors Alabama. And what I also think is interesting from the model's perspective is it's 5.7 yards per play for Bama, 5.3 for Auburn. That's not that different. But the yard per attempt numbers, the passing numbers for Bama at 9.3 to 6.4 is kind of the whole story. Auburn has not thrown the ball very well all year, at least not consistently. But Alabama also isn't expected to be able to run at 3.8 to 4.4 yard per carry. In our modeling system, Auburn is the number 7 run defense in the country and the number 62 pass defense. Our system, when it's opponent adjusted, really does not like Auburn's defense against the passing game. It allows teams right at their averages. Alabama's kind of the inverse. They give up, they're 49th in the country in run defense in our system. They're only 8th, but they're 8th against the pass. I think we saw that with Oklahoma, that they got run over a little bit. And so you get these two teams, one that stops the run, one that stops the pass, in a game where you'd think both teams are more run-based teams and Milroe is a runner. But I think that oversimplifies the problem. And I think the biggest problem, Daniel, is Alabama's inability to deal with edge pressure on a consistent basis. When they play on the road, one of the big things that people don't often give enough credence to is in a hostile environment, you have to change the way you do cadence. So something that really stood out to me on tape from the Oklahoma game is they're doing this thing where the guard turns and pats the center and then they snap the ball. That means the defense knows when they're going to snap as much as the offense does. And in fact, the tackle on the offensive tackles have to watch the snap because they don't know exactly when the snap's going to go for them to know when to step back. And so there were a number of times in that game, a lot of big plays, negative plays, where I saw the DNs and the edge players for Oklahoma actually get the first step at the snap, and you see the tackles just get whipped, and Herb Street mentioned it in the broadcast. I almost think it's a bit unfair because when you're playing in a loud or a hostile environment and you have a modified snap cadence scheme, it gets really hard for those tackles to get the jump. And if I do think Alabama's tackles have a bit of a problem getting back in pass pro, but it really magnifies it. It's the same reason why Alabama struggled on the road at Tennessee is because that was a loud environment. And Daniel, if you think about it with Vandy, they lost the Vandy game, but the offense didn't really have a lot of problems moving the football. And so this is a problem I've seen with Alabama for a few years. I think there's something, I know there's got to be something in the way Jalen Milroe does his cadence because they went away from the clap snap to that weird pat thing, which I think is problematic because you can say clap on 2 and you can do 2 claps and you can force the defense to not know when you're going to clap and snap. But when you do that touch snap silent count is easy to jump. That's why it's really hard to play on hostile loud environments. That's what they've gone to. They've had problems, dating back all the way through Milroe's tenure. There's some reason, obviously, they changed to this new system, even though I don't know the Oklahoma game was that loud. All that to say, Daniel, that problem doesn't exist for them in Tuscaloosa. And when they're in Tuscaloosa and they can actually have a normal cadence and a normal snap, those offensive tackles are going to be able to set their feet and get back. They're not going to give up edge pressures. And this leads into the second part of the theory, which I'll say and I'll let turn back to you. Alabama's had a lot of issues this year, obviously, when Jalen Milroe can't run the ball well. But I think Jalen Milroe being unable to run the ball well in those games is not the cause. It's more of a symptom of a lot of other issues. When he can't run the ball well, it's usually because they're giving up pressure on the edge, which means they do a lot of stuff laterally with him, and he gets tackled in the backfield or has to redirect. And the moment there's pressure, they can't do that. When he can't run because they're getting lateral pressure, he also has one of the longest times to throw in college football. I know last year I think he had the longest time to throw. I know it's Shedeur Sanders actually is another guy that's on up there, if not the lowest. And so edge pressure means when he's sitting back there in a deep pocket, he can't get the ball off downfield. They have a deep passing game. It's the thing he loves to do. You can't throw deep passes if you're getting deep pressure in the pocket. So all these things kind of coalesce, and it stops the Milroe run game. But it's not that he can't run that makes everything else bad. I think he can't run because what they want to do doesn't work. And Daniel, the real problem in all that is there's a whole bevy of things you'd want to do offensively in that situation with a short passing game, power inside run game to the running backs, running the zone read to take advantage of numbers if you're getting guys on the edge to at least make them account for Milroe while you run the ball with the backs, throws to the tight end underneath, throws between the hashes that just overall are not part of your offense. And I think a lot of it are due to limitations with what Jalen Milroe can do. A lot of it are due to limitations with how quickly he gets the ball off. I think he understands mentally the scheme. I don't think he processes it fast enough live. And I want to make the big difference. If you put me out there as a college football player, my eyes would get like saucers and I would stand there staring at everything on the field and I'd have no idea what was going on. And I just get clocked and probably get knocked out in a play, right? I'm not saying I blame him, and I feel like I'm an intelligent guy, but there's no way I could process it that fast. But that's the skill, and I don't know that it's a skill that he has. And because of that, and because of everything you take out of the playbook, it kind of leaves them in this quarterback run scheme with a very particular set of plays, and you either work when those work, or you don't work at all when they don't.
So, if you look at Peyton Thorne, it's interesting. Auburn hasn't put up a ton of points this year in really any game except for A&M. I'm talking against Power 4 competition. But Thorne puts up pretty decent numbers in a lot of them. 9 yards an attempt in several games. Looked a lot better against Oklahoma than Milroe did. I'm curious, I have some thoughts on Alabama's defense, and we might get into that in a second. But just talking about Auburn's offense, in terms of matching up against Alabama, the one thing they don't seem to do well is a team that's willing to take 4 or 5 yards, grind out, and not rely on deep balls. They've got a running back that can do that. They've got a good running quarterback. They don't run him a ton, but he's mobile enough. If you're Alabama, are you concerned about facing this type of Auburn offense, given that they're a little more on the side of things that seem to give you problems than something like a Missouri?
I think it depends, Daniel, a lot on how much they adjust their offense to what Alabama struggled with specifically. Because from what I've seen defensively for Alabama, they've had real issues with eye discipline. In particular, Oklahoma, it's not an exaggeration to say that they took plays straight out of Vanderbilt's playbook. And when I say that, I mean, veer, counter option, quarterback lead, inside. 3 times I saw him throw an inside pitch, like pop pass to the tight end, so that inside screen to the tight end coming across. that was a play that Vandy ran with a lot of success 3 or 4 times, and they ripped it straight off. There's a lot of plays where they run a zone read with an option component off the veer. Jackson Arnold's a really good athlete. Actually, I for a while had argued that it was a mistake to bench him for Hawkins because I actually think Hawkins is more athletic, but I think Arnold is a better runner because he's more physical. And so with all those things going on, Alabama's swarm defense, their problem, they're zone-based, they're eye-based. You have to have a lot of eye discipline, meaning where is the ball and where are my, what alleys do I have control of? Because if you swarm to the wrong point, you tend to leave a lane otherwise. And that's what I saw over and over on tape, is Alabama's swarming to the ball at the snap, but they're not having discipline to, oh, wait, that ball's actually been handed off to the running back on a counter. Oh, wait, that ball, the quarterback didn't give the ball. He kept it, and there's a pitch man. I need to follow the quarterback. Number 4, Russoff for Alabama, who's playing in for their outside linebacker, Robinson, that's out with an injury. He's a young player, I think maybe redshirt freshman. He struggled badly with that concept. Like, I saw him constantly running the wrong way. They've had problems at inside linebacker too, but I was really surprised how much they had issues with their edge players not reading the ball correctly, and they would chase a dive who didn't have it, and the quarterback would go around. And I say all that to say that that's not really Auburn's game. Typically, they are a typical zone read team, which means they're going to read the edge defender, keep or pull. It's not trickery and smoke and mirrors. It's more about, one read I go, one read I keep. And defensively, you just attack the mesh point. It's a lot simpler, and you don't have as many horizontal components. They also run a lot more typical RPO, which means that they're reading a nickel. Alabama's pick 6. That was actually an RPO play, right? Jalen Milroe was reading the outside linebacker, number 10. You can watch his eyes if you watch the tape. He pulls from the running back, turns and throws the screen, who's being defended by a different player because he's staring at the nickel defender. The same reason Oklahoma intercepted that ball is where Alabama does a good job, which is that when you're zone-based like that, you can really confuse a quarterback where they're staring at one guy, they turn and make a read and make a throw. That play was really reminiscent to, honestly, the interception that Thorne threw in the Oklahoma game to Lewis, I believe, the outside linebacker, where he made the right read from an RPO perspective, but throwing against a really well-disguised zone defense, he's reading one guy, so he throws the RPO, and then they pull a guy out into a zone that wasn't expected. You end up throwing an interception for a pick 6. So Alabama's defense, sort of similar from Oklahoma in that regard, heavy zone. If Auburn were to suddenly adapt and run more of those veer concepts and option concepts, and there were some option concepts against A&M, they did do some quarterback option with Hunter, but it's not their game. More bootleg, more veer, where you have 2 or 3 options from the quarterback in the run game. I think they could give Alabama issues, but that is a very particular style of offense that Vandy runs. Oklahoma is so limited, they know that they don't have great powerful linemen, but they're a little smaller because they're younger. They kind of adapted to it, and it worked. So I will say, it's kind of a breakdown Alabama and Auburn offensively. Hopefully it's an interesting discussion. And again, if you find it interesting, like and subscribe. If you don't, let us know. But I don't know that will translate per se unless Auburn wants to adopt it. And to be really clear, that's a scheme and system that you can't just wake up and adopt. And Daniel, this is an undersold point about that Oklahoma game. Oklahoma came off a bye. Oklahoma probably spent that bye week installing what was in large part Vanderbilt's offensive system to fit Arnold, and it was highly successful against Alabama in that defense. I don't think an Auburn team that just had to put everything on the line to play Texas A&M is going to be equipped to do that in 2 or 3 days. They might put in some, but all that ball movement is really dangerous if you're not familiar with it. So I don't know that Auburn's offense, in short, is really equipped to do what Oklahoma did. I don't think any team can just pick up and run what Oklahoma ran. That was a bit of a perfect storm where Oklahoma had a bye week to install a very particular type of offense that gave Alabama fits. And I do think it's a little different. So I think Auburn and Alabama is much more of a straight-up matchup. And that Oklahoma game, quite frankly, can be kind of put aside with the Vandy game as sort of a unique problem. To Oklahoma's credit that they figured out how to attack Alabama, but maybe not something somebody can do really outside of possibly a bowl situation versus Alabama.
It's also worth noting Vanderbilt also had a bye week, and they were working on Alabama while Alabama was playing Georgia. So that's an interesting note. I do think at home it matters. If you're an Alabama fan, you do maybe worry a little bit about the mental makeup of the team, especially since this is a Milroe-led team, and it seems like the team sort of goes as his mental toughness goes. So you wonder about an Auburn team coming in with a lot of momentum and playing for bowl eligibility, while Alabama's coming into this game playing for pride, a good bowl game. I don't know. There might be an outside chance the playoffs too, just depending on how things shake out, but you do wonder about that. I will note on the Alabama defensive situation, if you're not used to Alabama football defensively giving a lot of ground, then it does feel like you're being dominated. And that's just not how this defense is set up. They have given up a lot of long drives this year, but in only one game have they given up a lot of points. Offensively or defensively, they really gave up 10 points in this game. They did give up a red zone score. Ball started on the 16-yard line after the interception, and then those are the other pick six. So really 14 points of their 24 were thanks to Jalen Milroe and not the defense. They are going to allow a lot in between the 20s, but they're also going to force turnovers, and they're also going to do a lot in the red zone to hold teams to field goals. It feels like Alabama's defense is worse than it has been in the past, but they're 11th in scoring. They're better than last year's defense in almost every metric. The only one they're trailing is rushing yards per carry, and they're off by like 1%. And they're still higher rated. They're just off in terms of raw numbers. I am curious. I don't know how much the motivation game plays once you get into the game, into the first quarter. Then it is a little more about just better athletes, better schemes, things like that, better preparedness. But I wonder if Auburn comes in and just jumps on them a little bit early, if that does sort of start a spiral. And that's something we've seen with Milroe a little bit, is that, I don't know that I've seen this, even in the multi-interception games from Thorne, I don't know that I've seen him get sort of shell-shocked the way that Milroe does seem to get in some of these games against good defenses. Talk a little bit about, I would argue that Venables fields what is an elite defense, maybe doesn't show as well because the offense constantly giving the ball back to the other team, but the two games where Milroe completely shut down and was ineffective were Tennessee and Oklahoma. In your opinion, if Tennessee and Oklahoma are 10s, where would you put this Auburn's defense as it matches up against Alabama?
As it matches up against Alabama or overall?
As it matches up against Alabama.
I mean, I'd probably put it more like a 6 or 7, Daniel,
okay.
Honestly. And this actually gets to a point I was thinking about bringing up later, but I'll go ahead and do it. When you talk about like rushing defense, Auburn's 5th in the conference, Oklahoma's 3rd, Tennessee's 2nd. The gap doesn't seem that significant. About 3 yards per play to about 2.8 to Tennessee is all that's separating them. But the big difference between those teams is how they get to that number, and that's who tackles for loss. So Oklahoma and Tennessee are 2nd and 3rd in the conference, 89 or 88 tackles for loss. Auburn is actually down towards the bottom. So Missouri's got 62. They're 10th. Auburn is 11th at 61. Alabama actually is 13th, 58. LSU is 14th at 55. And what you've seen from Alabama to start the whole discussion is that they've really struggled when you can get disruption in the backfield, because they have a problem, in my opinion, with how long it takes for Milroe to get the ball off. Just sort of the resultant issues that creates for them offensively, because anytime you're in the backfield, Milroe, there were a couple plays on tape where I watched him, zone read pull game. There's one play in particular where he gets stopped, behind the line. I think it was late in the game, where they've got 2 power linemen. Number 40 for Oklahoma comes in, I think downs, and just hits Milroe in the backfield for like a 5-yard loss. But what's telling to me is Milroe kind of like tries to fake a pass, which wasn't really an RPO. I don't know if that was by design or what he was doing, but it was a power run. He really needed to hit the hole. And there was actually a seam there if he'd gone. But you see him get killed by 3 guys because he's deep in the pocket. He gets tackled where he gets the snap on a design run. That shouldn't happen. I mean, he's supposed to be moving forward, but he's just kind of slow to get moving. But once he hits the hole and has a seam, he can be good. So it's so much with him in the passing game and run game is just about disruption. And Auburn is more stout and sound. They've done a good job with their personnel. They do not have necessarily top-end elite disruptive personnel in that front seven, in my opinion, compared to some of the other SEC teams. I mean, Oklahoma's front seven, for all their issues, defensively in the back end, they have issues. They've got some really good edge rushers. Again, they get pressure. Tennessee has phenomenal edge rushers. Those are the teams that have given them fits. LSU doesn't have great defensive linemen and great disruptive defensive linemen, and Alabama eat them alive. I think Auburn is a much better defense than LSU. That's why they're 6-7 in my mind, because they can stop the run. But, Daniel, I think it's more complicated than just saying if you can stop Milroe as a runner, if you can stop the run, you defeat Alabama. Again, Auburn's 6th in our system in run defense. The issue I see, the reason why this is a 13-point spread, is I think it's more nuanced. It's about your ability to disrupt plays behind the line of scrimmage. It's about your ability to get Milroe in the backfield. It's about your ability to rush the passer with speed on the edge and beat those tackles. In a home environment where the tackles can set the edge, and it gets a team in Auburn that is, to be clear, they're good at disruption. I mean, they're 8th in sacks, but LSU's 6th. They're not Oklahoma, who's 3rd. They're not South Carolina, who's 2nd, you know. They don't quite have the same oomph there, and so I do think it lowers it to a good matchup for Auburn defensively, but probably won't one that will have the same just show-stopping shutdown of an offense that we've seen a couple times from the Tennessee game and the Oklahoma game in particular for them. And I do want to say, you know, I feel like we haven't talked about that enough. I mean, Auburn did just play a Texas A&M team that was, you know, Marcel Reed's out there. He is a run-first guy. You know, the LSU game, when they won that game, he only threw 2 passes, I think. And they did a pretty good job containing him. He had 66 yards and 21 carries. I mean, overall, Texas A&M won that game throwing the ball. They only ran for 3.2 yards of carries, only, you know, 167 yards, yes, but on 52 attempts. Auburn won that game, but A&M scored 41 because they threw for 297 yards at 8.5 yards per attempt. If it had been for the run game, they would have kept them contained. And so my whole point with that is, even with a dual-threat runner, they still let him run somewhat. They couldn't shut him down, and they allowed a lot more through the air than most people have to read as a passer. So that all kind of fits with what I'm saying, that I don't know that Auburn is really built to deal with these dual-threat quarterbacks that effectively. I think there's some wiggle room for Alabama to be a lot more effective against Auburn. I do think Auburn defensively is much more similar to Missouri. Maybe better in some ways, frankly, maybe worse in some others. The question I have, Daniel, and I'll turn it back to you for this part of the conversation and put you on the spot for once. I think the question is whether Alabama's going to be able to stop Auburn. Because the thing that really jumps out to me on a lot of our metrics is our system thinks Auburn's offense is pretty good. 24th in the country in rushing, 38th in passing. We have this player statistic, and I'm letting you buy some time here, where we have this thing called Nerd Performance Index for quarterbacks. And Peyton Thorne is not a good quarterback by most measures, but he's still top 25 in our system. We have him 25th. We have Ewers 22nd. You can go to collegefootballnerds.com and look at all this in your heart's content. That's not terrible. And I mean, Texas A&M is a pretty good defense on the season. They put up 469 yards, and it was in overtime, but they moved the ball effectively. They had some really good drives early, almost 10 yards per pass attempt. So my question to you, Daniel, is what do you think of Auburn's offense versus the specific type of system that Alabama runs? And, you know, where would you grade them 1 to 10? I mean, if Vandy is an 8 or a 9, and people may laugh, but I think Vandy's particular scheme is effective versus Alabama. Where do you rate Auburn? Let's say Vandy's a 7, Daniel. Where do you put Auburn in relation to that?
Probably a 5. I think that Auburn fans might get frustrated with that, but Auburn has played now through an entire SEC schedule except for Alabama, and one mediocre Power 4 opponent in California. They've hit They've scored more than 21 twice. Kentucky, they scored 24, and Texas A&M, they scored what they scored, 43-41. I mean, they scored 7 points just a few weeks ago against that Vandy defense. That's pretty bad. They scored 17 against Missouri, 13 against Georgia, 14 against Arkansas, 14 against Cal. So I think that's in a normal scenario. They also, remember, don't have a good kicker. He had some big kicks in the game against A&M, but in general, they haven't had good kicking this year. For an Alabama team that's really tough in the red zone, there could be a situation where they have to go for it on fourth and turn the ball over just on downs a couple of times because they don't have faith in their kicker. Now, that's a very specific scenario. I'm not saying that's how it's going to play out, but that's just something worth note. I think Auburn has a lot of momentum, and I think that the human factor here, because after I watched that awesome game from Auburn Saturday night, I was like, Auburn's going to beat Alabama now. But that's the overreaction in the moment of those two things just happening back to back. I still think the Iron Bowl is important for these two teams. The only thing in the back of my mind is Alabama is starting to have big injuries on defense. Overton, I think, came back in that game against Oklahoma, but you've got your signal caller out for the year. You've got, as you noted, they're playing a depth player on the outside. So you have a downgrade there because Lawson was, I think, he was clearly a better player. I think that the one guy's doing a good job for Sapp's replacement, but in general, the injuries are starting to mount up a little bit for Alabama. I think they'll be able to hold on in this game just enough. I think the home crowd is going to help just enough. Hubbard is the name I was thinking of. I don't know why I was blanking there. Give me 24. Give me Alabama 24, Auburn 17.
And my gut, based on this spread and based on the discussion we just had, is that Auburn is a closer team to Alabama in quality than many people want to admit. I mean, our system has had Auburn in close games a lot this year, even though we haven't talked about them a ton due to their record. And they've lost a lot of close games. And so I don't really think Auburn's a bad team. I mean, my biggest indictment on Freeze this year, Daniel, is really the fact that I think Auburn should have had a better record than they do with the team they had. They certainly shouldn't have lost to Cal. Botching late in the Oklahoma game. Frankly, I find it bizarre that there are a lot of Auburn fans calling to play the backup quarterbacks now to get them ready. Because one, I haven't seen anything from the young quarterbacks that says that they're not going to have to take another transfer. But two, the Arkansas game, they win that game if they play Thorne the whole game. I mean, they totally beat Arkansas. They're a better team than Arkansas. So all that said, I don't like Auburn and how they match up with what their schemes are versus Alabama. And I do think there's an overreaction to last week. Texas A&M runs a very unique scheme. They're not a particularly good run defense. Their offense is predicated on this dual threat runner-passer, but they did put up points on Auburn. They kind of got shell-shocked early on the road and then came back. And then Alabama played a team coming off a bye that literally installed a huge chunk of Vanderbilt's offense that Alabama probably hadn't prepared for and did not execute well with, and then just had a total implosion versus a particular set of problems defensively, where Oklahoma is a very good defense and they are just able to do some things that I don't think Auburn can do. And so with all that, Daniel, it makes me want to give something that sounds crazy. Like, I'm going to say, I'll say 34-17. And that sounds nuts, but think of the point spread. It's 13 points, 48 over under. I'm barely picking Alabama to cover, and I'm barely picking the over. And if the score prediction I gave sounds nuts, or people would say it's a homer score or whatever, however you want to view it either way, the thing we often talk about, Daniel, is Vegas is rarely crazy. And sometimes they give point spreads. I called this out on Twitter, right? I thought the Texas A&M Auburn point spread was bizarre because it was 2.5 points for A&M. A&M had all this momentum going into the game. We talked privately, Daniel, and you could verify this. I was pretty well convinced that Auburn was probably going to win that game. Just based on everything I looked at in matchups. We didn't do a video on it, but it was more and more obvious to me, the more people I talked to, the more I looked at it, that due to matchups and everything else, due to the quality of Auburn overall, where A&M was, that Auburn actually, I think Vegas thought Auburn was going to win the game, but they knew people would bet on A&M. They were happy to let people bet on A&M. Sometimes I think Vegas does do that in rare instances. I've heard that the public loaded up on them, and then Vegas was happy to take all their money and give it to the few Auburn fans that actually thought Auburn would win the game. I don't think it's this situation. Auburn has momentum, Alabama does not. They're still giving Alabama a ton of points. I think it's too much of a matchup issue for Auburn. I do think Auburn's a close team. Maybe it's a close game overall. I think any game with Jalen Milroe, it's obvious that when he gets spooked, like in the second half, and rattled, things can fall apart. But all that said, Daniel, I'm going to leave on one point, and I'll let you say your piece, but this is kind of the last word for me. I've been on record a couple different forums from, you can follow us on Twitter at College Football Nerds, College Football Nerds, obviously on YouTube, Spotify. We've got our website as well for stats at collegefootballnerds.com. I will say today, my son, for those who've been praying for my family, was able to finally come home from the NICU. So we haven't updated the website and some things the way we'd like, but, we've been dealing with a lot of really serious family issues. We're happy to do this. But between all those platforms, what we have been able to put out, I don't think Alabama has a chance at a national title. And I know you put a thread together, so I'm giving you a segue to talk about it. But Alabama has real issues against certain schemes and certain quality defense because their playbook is limited to certain things. And I don't think Auburn arises to the level where the Alabama can't run their plays. And so I think this game looks a lot more like the Missouri game did for Alabama. But in terms of Alabama fans wanting to say this is a wasted season, I think inevitably they were going to end up in the situation they ran into last year with the Michigan game, where they did Tennessee game this year, Oklahoma game this year. There's going to be a team that had a good enough defense where Alabama was going to run into a brick wall and could not score, and they were going to get knocked out of the playoffs. Their system was, I thought, good enough that it should have, and I think should have, absent defensive turnovers, gotten them to the playoff. I've never had confidence that they could really win through it. And I think this Auburn game is going to be another one where they're going to look good and you're going to think they're going to turn it around and people will want to hype them up. But I think this is an inherent problem with this Alabama team and the system and what they're able to do with Milroe, that they just don't have the ability to scale or to deal with certain issues. And so it's boom or bust depending on whether or not their scheme works versus your scheme and personnel. And if it doesn't, it doesn't.
We've said for 2.5 years now that Jalen Milroe is a boom or bust quarterback. And Oklahoma did something that a couple of teams have been able to do, and that's take away the deep ball in the run game. The challenge is you can't just look at Jalen Milroe and say, well, the guy sucks, because he doesn't. He has a great arm. He can throw a great deep ball. He's accurate with a deep ball, and he can run. The issue is he can't execute what I said on Twitter was the meat and potatoes of a normal passing tree, a normal passing game. So I likened it to a team that's very three-point heavy. Alabama basketball is this team. And the challenge when you are three-point heavy, even if you're very good at it, is you're going to hit a night where you're off. Or you're going to hit a night that takes it away. Or a team takes it away. And they force you into a mid-range game, and Jalen Milroe doesn't have that. So then you completely shut down. You go from you can be an elite offense if they can't stop either one, to a really good offense if they stop one of them. But if they can stop both of those things, you go to non-functional. Second half of Tennessee, Alabama was non-functional. 3 points against Oklahoma. 1 touchdown was taken off the board that they earned. But there are inherent problems with Jalen Milroe, and Kalen DeBoer inherited a team where he lost his offensive coordinator and his offensive line coach right before he started spring practice. Had to scramble and promote Sheridan from tight ends coach. So now you have a downgrade at tight ends coach. You have a tight ends coach now calling your offense, and then you have to cut your playbook in half and he's even come out and said this, that they're not running DeBoer's offense. So Alabama fans, don't get discouraged. He's done what he could do with what he had this year. and Milroe is who he is at this point. There's now 3 coordinators who have struggled with him. He limits what you can do. When you see the flashes, it's very intoxicating. But in terms of a consistent offense, he just limits it. And that's okay. They didn't. I think that you're right that they could win a game or two in the playoffs, but they were at some point going to run into a team that could do what Oklahoma did, and then they have to pray that they win at 13-10, or inevitably they're going to lose. So I don't think that Alabama fans should be too upset about missing the playoffs this year. I think that, if you're Alabama, the standard is national championship or bust. And so from that standpoint, it might be a silver lining in that Jalen Milroe might declare to go pro or might sit out and transfer. I don't know what he might do, but there might be an opportunity for a backup quarterback to finally get a full game's worth of reps. The stat I put out there the other day, I'm not high on Ty Simpson, but I also think that he might be pressing a little bit because he doesn't get a lot of reps. So when he gets in there, he's trying to do everything to show that he can do what he can do. Tua Tagovailoa had 53 passing attempts before the Georgia game his freshman year. Ty Simpson in 3 years at Alabama has 50 pass attempts. The guy's not getting any playing time, and it's because Alabama runs an offense and is limited as an offense that the backups aren't getting in. They've got so many artificially close games against inferior teams where you would normally see backups in. They're not getting in. So I do think there's inherent flaws here. We didn't talk enough about Auburn, but I think that they're going to be in better shape next year and the year after at quarterback. That's really where they were kind of lacking this year. But I still think that Alabama's going to have enough in this game to get the win. I think overall they're a little bit better team. All right, y'all, that was a long one from us. A lot to talk about. We love talking about these two teams because we watch them a lot. And this is a great, great rivalry. I think this is the best rivalry in college football. One more thing before I do an outro on that. Michigan, Ohio State, not the best rivalry. I'm sorry. They don't live in the same state. So they need to go back to their respective corners. They don't have to deal with each other all year. And then they have pro sports in their respective states to distract from the rivalry. So you don't have anything like that in Alabama. So thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.